I'm Isabel Pelly. I'm the technical coordinator for the Cash Dining Partnership. It's great to see so many of you on the line, friends old and new. So this is one of many sessions in CaLP's webinar series. And in fact, this was an ad hoc webinar that we decided to set up in response to a lively discussion on the CaLP D group a few weeks ago. And this discussion was on a recurrent operational issue faced by humanitarian agencies implementing cash transfer programs. And that is the valuation of contracts with service providers for cash transfer programs and the calculation of the associated procurement thresholds and levels of authorization required. So what the D group discussion highlighted is that there's a lack of consensus around this topic and a need for more standardization. So the purpose of this webinar in light of that discussion is to try and address these questions and share knowledge of understanding of different agency and donor positions on these issues, discuss best practice, and then see whether we can move towards consensus in light of a potential standardization of these approaches. So as such, the outcome of the webinar will be the definition of next steps to move this discussion forwards in more depth, and potentially of developing sector-wide operational standards on this issue. And in order to keep this discussion going, we'll be setting up a Google Doc where you can input on a proposal for consensus around this topic, but I'll update you more on that in the conclusions. So before I go on and present our panel, I wanted to just go through a couple of little housekeeping points. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with GoToWebinar as a platform. Hopefully it's quite intuitive. The webinar will be recorded. The chat box at the bottom on the right-hand corner of your screens is one that you should all be able to access and contribute to throughout the discussion. So I will be using this chat box. I will be reviewing your inputs, and as chair I'll be combining those and then posing kind of collective questions to the speakers. And we'd rather use this chat box rather than raising your hand. And please make sure that when you use the chat box, please make sure that it's for the whole audience. Then the other point is that PowerPoints will be shared after the presentation, as well as a follow-up email with a link to the Google document that I mentioned. So unless there are any pending questions, which feel free to share in the chat, I will be moving on with introducing our panel. So thanks a lot, first of all, to our panelists for accepting to speak and for engaging in preparing this session. And thanks also to my colleagues Vincent and Steph, who've supported the preparation of this webinar. So our panelists today are firstly Claire Durham, who is a Senior Officer Cash Transfer Programming Innovations at IFRC, based in Geneva. And Claire will be introducing the discussion by setting out what the problem statement, what are the issues, why is this a challenging topic, and so framing the discussion for us. Then we'll be moving on to an intervention by Natalie Abramo, who is a independent procurement and supply chain expert, and she is currently overseeing the Fritz Institute led task team for the development of CTP operational capacity building materials. That's quite a mouthful, but she'll be able to tell you more. Then in addition to Natalie's insight will be updating us on what the Fritz Institute task team has been discussing on this topic and a potential way forwards in terms of consensus. I'll then be introducing a couple of additional panel members. So one of whom is Sarah Murray, who is the head of the Electronic Cash Transfer Learning Action Network, also known as ELAN. And she'll be talking about some of the challenges with regards to procurement of financial service providers and payment platforms. And then Richard Atkinson from Oxfam, who will be also providing his operational perspective on this issue. And then we will open the forum up and hope to have many questions and interventions from you all, so please don't hesitate to share your experiences. So at this stage, I'm going to hand over to Claire for an introduction to the topic.
Thank you, Isabel. Just going to get my presentation up on screen. Oh. Right, there we go. Can everyone see that? Okay. Okay, well, I have been following the discussions on the D group. I think this is an interesting discussion, and I think there were quite different views potentially on some of this stuff, but from looking at what everyone was saying, and certainly from our point of view, what I think the problem statement is, I will kind of take you through my thoughts on what we need to address with this issue. Ooh. Okay, so for the contract valuation, I actually think that was fine. I think most people had got rationale for reaching that valuation. Certainly from our SOPs, it's very clear how we reach that contract valuation. We often work at the higher estimates if we want to have growth within an operation. So I think that's fine. And also procurement thresholds. We've got very clear procurement thresholds. Typically, the lower levels don't count for us at the size and scale of operation that we work at. And the procurement process is basically the same. It's just different as to whether it's completed in the field, if it's at the regional level, or whether it's at headquarters in Geneva. So I was okay with that too. But I thought that there were some challenges, certainly from our side, in terms of the application of these thresholds. And really it's more to do with the fact that they're sometimes elevated. So even though something should happen at the field or the regional level, whether this is because it's new or whether it's because it's considered to be more risky, then often it's elevated to the Geneva level for us to get involved. And I think that could be an issue going forward. The procurement information is the thing that I found the most challenging. And I've gone through all of our SOPs, the logistics, our cash SOPs, finance SOPs, and there does seem to be a difference depending on who the stakeholder is, so finance, legal, what information that they want. And often we get this kind of asked at the last minute, and so it's really not clear what we're saying we're going to ask in a tender package, and what is really useful for us to be able to make decisions on suppliers. So that's the area that I think interests us the most, and certainly looking at best practice. Then there's a couple of other things which weren't mentioned in the D group discussions, but I thought might be interesting if we've got time to talk about them. One is this move to a single delivery platform, and if we are going to be doing that, which is what was mentioned in the grand bargain, and we've seen other donors say around using this, so if one agency has one delivery mechanism that we're all supposed to use, how does that impinge on procurement and on our own internal risks and risk mitigation factors? So I think that's something we're going to need to consider. And then innovation and piloting. If we want to do a quick and small pilot, we still have to go through the procurement process, and is there a way that we can, if we want to refine requirements or if we want to test something out, see if it works in a context, how can we make that happen? So I'd like to focus, because I know that we don't have that much time, if possible, more on the procurement information and what do we need to really be able to evaluate suppliers when we're doing the procurement. So I think this is the problem statement, that I think we are currently struggling to objectively and quickly really be able to evaluate suppliers. And I think this kind of stems from two parts. Like, can we work with a supplier? So this is really around the regulatory and compliance issues. So the information that our finance and our legal teams are looking for, are we able to actually contract with this supplier? And then the solution side of things. So this is really the programmatic side. Will this solution, this system, this delivery mechanism actually meet our functional and programmatic requirements? And so how are we able to very quickly be able to evaluate suppliers on that? So I've just been undertaking, I'm still in the process of doing a big procurement tender in Greece. So some of this stuff is kind of hot off the press, and it's kind of what sparked my interest in this topic. But we were going through and putting together the tender document, and then there was lots of information that was required by stakeholders but wasn't necessarily shared with us at the time. So I'm really trying to pull together a big matrix of the documents or the information that the different stakeholders, logistics, finance, legal programs, need in order for us to go to tender. We also had some issues of additional steps or additional information. So we had to get a letter from the local lawyer in Greece to say whether we could move money in and out, which if we'd known that ahead of time would have made life easier. We had an additional step where we were asked to run the tender by someone in our organisation who used to work for a large card company. And so all these additional steps, of course, then add time. And what I was hoping to do with this matrix is to get to a state of saying, well, what is the mandatory information that we need, and roughly what are the timelines? So as I was saying, that legal letter, which took several weeks for us to draft it, to make sure the questions in there were correct, for us to send it to the lawyers to get a response back. And so if we know what information is needed, we can set that off early. And then who's responsible for outlining or obtaining what information? So again, we were asked as programs to draft that legal letter, which I was saying is not something that we're best placed to do. We also had challenges with some of the delegates in the country who are perhaps less familiar with procurement processes, who thought that logistics would outline the requirements or the scope of work. So again, being clear up front for those people less familiar with this, or agreeing with key stakeholders who's going to get what information. And then we also had some challenges around changes to standard documents. So in this case, for example, we have a standard contract that's part of our SOPs. It's agreed with all stakeholders, and yet they wanted to, the legal wanted to change it for this tender. And of course, that takes time and effort. And so internally, again, what is it that would make us change a standard document? And then ultimately kind of getting to, you know, what is best practice and what is it that we're trying to just feel comfortable with. So again, if I use the legal letter, maybe that is best practice. Maybe all of us should be getting that letter or that kind of agreement, not just from the supplier, but from a regulatory body to say we can do cash transfer programming. And so really trying to understand what is best practice. And I felt that would probably be something that we could do as a sector rather than each individually as an agency. So in summary, what I was really trying to get to is what is the best practice and what is the most helpful way for us to get the information we need to make a decision, and also what is reasonable to ask for. Because ultimately, if we're asking for lots of different documentation, but none of it really helps us to be able to decide if this is a supplier that we can work with and if they can provide the solution we want, then it's kind of pointless asking for it. And some of the challenges that we've been having are, particularly if we're not using banks, which our finance team obviously are very familiar with working with banks, but if we're using either less regulated or non-regulated money transfer entities, or if we're using some of these fintech companies. So these are consolidations of a financial service provider but linked with some kind of technology, so like the Red Roses or Segovias that we're seeing. How do we evaluate those suppliers in a way that's not traditional to the kind of suppliers that we've worked with? And for me, we need to be able to do this both against the requirements of the tender. So can we be sure we can work with the supplier and that they meet our needs as we've laid them out? And then how do we compare financial service providers against each other so that we can ultimately reach the one or the several suppliers that we want to contract with. And so this for me is the most interesting thing, because I can't believe that we're the only people grappling with this, and I wanted to really see what other organizations are doing, what is their best practice, how have they gone around approaching this. And this is kind of my rationale for wanting to have this discussion. And then, as I alluded to earlier, there's a couple of aspects which I don't know if we've got time to talk about today, but if we start to go down this single delivery platform, and so one agency is contracting, and I know this has happened in some operations already, and I think it's happened in Jordan at least. How do we mitigate the risks? So all the things that are still applicable when we do the procurement, if we are going to be using another agency's delivery mechanism, how can we be sure that we are mitigating those risks, that we're meeting regulatory requirements, all the things that our internal stakeholders need us to be able to demonstrate when we're doing the procurement, that we're also making sure that we meet the procurement rules and regulations and donor compliance. And if on audit that doesn't happen, what does that mean for the agencies that have been using this delivery mechanism? And also, how do we report on some of this stuff? Well, certainly for delivery mechanisms that don't have a wallet aspect, then it's all the money on prepaid cards, for example, would all go onto one card. So how would we be able to determine what had been spent where, and how could we relate that to our donor funding and what we had received? And then the innovation and piloting. I'm not trying to circumvent the logistics processes. Of course, they're there for a reason. We should absolutely adhere to them. But if we want to try something new, or if we want to try something new for our implementing partners, so maybe they haven't done electronic cash before, maybe they've only done it in recovery but not in response, or maybe they just think it's much more complicated, or they want to go to scale and they haven't done that before. Is there a way, and something we would hope to do for Greece was to do a very small, limited pilot, just to see how it worked. We would also be able to see the capacity of the Hellenic Red Cross and their ability to be able to scale this, which would help us then design the program, and how big to scale we want to go, or how quickly we could do that. But the procurement rules really don't allow us to do that. We always really have to go out to tender and get those quotes, which is fine, but if you're doing a very small scale, that takes a lot of time, and in the end we said, well, we'll just go and do it because the amount of time to do the tender. And I just wondered whether there was a way, and if donors were open to us looking at being able to do something that was innovative, or it was piloting without breaching the procurement rules, but also not giving us free rein to be able to just not use the procurement rules at all. So that was a quick run through, and that's really because I wanted to set the scene. I think it's going to be more interesting to hear other people's comments and points. I'll just go back to the summary, but yeah, what do people think is the information that we need, or in what format do we need that information to really make decision making efficient and effective? Okay, Isabel, I can hand back to you.
Thank you, Claire. I think you got us straight into the heart of the matter, explaining that there are things that we do have consensus over, but also some of these bigger challenges now. I particularly liked you posing the two about common delivery platforms and innovation and piloting. So I'm sure there's lots of inputs on that. I am having a slight technical issue in that I can't see people's questions, but Vincent is kindly sending them to me, and I'm aware that some of you might have raised your hands as well. So what we'll do is try and answer the questions that have been raised already, and then maybe broaden the discussion, I think, to some of these two challenges around common delivery platforms and innovation and piloting. So the first question that I'm going to pose to Claire, which has come from anonymous from my side, sorry, is what is the measure to take in minimizing risk in respect of procurement? So I think that's quite a broad question, but perhaps you can elaborate on some of your experiences within the Federation.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, risk obviously covers a wide range of things. Certainly from our side, we're looking at sort of the credit worthiness from the compliance and regulatory side, making sure that there's no risk on not meeting laws, not breaching any laws in terms of things like how much money we can transfer, can we transfer it back. We were looking at single and multi-load cards, for example, but you can't give out multiple single load cards because you're circumventing the rules and regulations there. So there are those kind of risks, which are really the compliance and regulatory risks. I guess there's risks about how much money we transfer to companies as well, and making sure that they're going to deliver what they say they're going to deliver. I don't think, though, that there are, maybe apart from the regulatory stuff, we're making sure that we're meeting banking laws or those kind of things. I don't think there's that many more risks that are different to the goods. And this is what I'm finding a little bit frustrating, because I know that we buy millions of pounds worth of goods, and we have a way of being able to validate those suppliers, which aren't banks. So what I keep trying to push the team here back to, and the stakeholders back to, is, well, if we do it for goods, can we apply something that's not banking? So I think it's probably the same for most procurement, and we mitigate and manage that.
Thank you. I think you raise, an underlying point around this discussion, which is, are we applying different standards of risk? I think it's perhaps risk that we're less used to dealing with, particularly in terms of financial regulations. So rather than more risk per se. So we have another question. So that question, by the way, was from Alassane Soubebu Kantama. And now we have another comment from Nick Anderson, who is saying, I would be interested in hearing opinions from different individuals on their comfort levels with using sole source waivers for these type of procurements, how to balance compliance with expediency in particular. So perhaps Claire, you can start with some feedback on that, and then for those who would also like to contribute, please raise your hands, and then Vincent can unmute you.
Okay, well, from our side, we haven't gone down the sole source, because typically when we're looking at cards or remittance or these kind of things, then there is nearly always more than one supplier. And so that hasn't come up yet. It will be interesting, I think, when we look more at some of these fintech companies, so like the Segovias and that of the world, to try and demonstrate that they are the sole supplier of that type of product actually is quite difficult, and it's quite hard to be able to demonstrate that to our logistics team. So we haven't had to do that yet, but I know that could be quite a challenge when we get there, of how do we show that this, particularly if it's an innovative product, is it really innovative, or are there more than one supplier out there? So I think that will be a challenge, but we haven't had to address it just yet, but I know it's coming.
Perhaps could I suggest that Nick provides his own experience of where that's been justified and why. If he can be unmuted by Vincent, please. Nick, would you be able to comment on that? Okay, perhaps that's not working for Nick, yeah, my personal experience of when that has happened has been when actually it's to do with the contract valuation, and actually when the contract valuation has also and the procurement thresholds have included the total value of the fees being transferred, which was one of the subjects of discussion on the D group, and which I know that Natalie is going to tackle next. So I can see some questions coming through which are in relation to how you calculate transfer fees and the contract valuation overall, and I think that Natalie is well placed to address those in her next intervention. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to share on their experiences of common delivery platforms and how some of the procurement implications of that when you're working at an interagency level? Perhaps by typing into the question box or raising your hands. Okay, if there's no one on that so far, I hope it's a topic that we can return to later in the discussion. I think that lots of questions have already been raised, and hopefully through our next interventions, we'll be able to address them. So I'm going to thank Claire now and then hand over to Natalie for a summary of the issues as the Fritz task team have been tackling them.
Okay, can everybody see my screen right now? And if you see my screen, do you see the on-air stuff on the right-hand side? Okay, I'm going to assume that's a no. Fantastic. So I'm Natalie Abramo. I'm an independent consultant currently with Fritz Institute, and I am managing their program to develop operations training for cash. Before this particular job with Fritz Institute, I was the focal point for procurement for the World Food Program. So that also adds a little bit of my background or expertise or where I have knowledge on how this all comes together. So, oh dear. Nope, it is working. Okay, there we go. First of all, who is Fritz Institute? Because many of you may not have heard of us before. Fritz Institute is a very small nonprofit based in California. It's 7 a.m. here, bright and early. And Fritz Institute focuses on systemic issues that all humanitarian agencies face, areas where it makes a lot more sense, especially value-wise, if an organization finds a solution on behalf of the entire sector. And Fritz Institute also tackles issues that are not really part of your frontline mandate. So humanitarian organizations have a responsibility to deliver to the beneficiaries. We do not have any sort of frontline responsibilities. So we just focus on these back office humanitarian sector systemic issues to help the overall sector. One of the particular programs that Fritz developed, its initial launch was, I believe, in about 2006, was the Humanitarian Logistics Certification Program, and it was the first interagency fundamentals program on logistics and supply chain activities. It taught how do you map out a warehouse, how do you manage a transport schedule, how do you run or issue a tender and procure for the sector. The absolute basics. And this is important because it, one, brought UN, Red Cross, and nonprofit NGO organizations together to determine basic principles as a group. Originally, the logisticians and supply chain experts coming in said, it can't be done, it's different. And when they got down to the crux of the issues, they found that they really could create an interagency approach. It's also important because how we first got involved in this, in our current project, is we were updating this humanitarian logistics certification program for the requirements of the humanitarian sector, that is, the trend towards cash, and what do logistics and supply chain staff need to know about cash in order to be effective humanitarian logisticians. In this process, we ended up partnering with CaLP because there is a need to really look at operations support for more than just supply chain and logistics, to help develop a training that covers all of operations and delivery functions. So finance, IT, logistics, procurement, and security together. And so that is the training that we're developing now, as opposed to just updating the original logistics program. Now, this initiative to develop an interagency operations training program for cash is being overseen by an interagency task force, UN, NGO, and Red Cross organizations together. And it has been challenging to date because in many cases there aren't simple best practice information, there isn't best practice information available. And so we've had to bring together working groups of subject matter experts in order to determine what should the approach be. Where the original humanitarian logistics certification program relied on commercial logistics standards, how they ran warehouses to create initial information or content for the course, that's not available for cash operations. So we've been running these working groups. In May, we brought together a working group on finance, IT, and compliance. And one of the issues that we brought up was the development, or was the valuation of contracts. The participants in the room during that discussion were the American Red Cross, International Rescue Committee, Oxfam, and World Vision. And in preparation for those discussions, IFRC, Mercy Corps, UNICEF, and WFP contributed materials that were reviewed, but they couldn't join the actual meeting. So this is what was reviewed at that time. So the valuation issue, because this is more of where we focused as opposed to the procurement documentation that Claire reviewed. What is the service being procured? It is the transfer of cash or a value to a beneficiary. It could be one time, it might be iterative. What are the fees for the services being provided? Variable, fixed, combination, one time, other batch fees, reporting, returns, accounts, setups, early termination, help desks, etc. Who are the potential service providers, regulated and unregulated? And this is where there is this blend, this fintech blending of two worlds, where technology service providers are increasingly now providing money services and having accounts, and these fintech providers are operating outside the scope of the traditional banking area. So you have regulated and unregulated. And the actual cash being transferred to the service provider includes both the service fees and the transfer value. And this becomes important later on. So what is the question? Is the value of the contract just the fees that are being paid to the service provider for doing the service? Or do you value the contract around the fees and the transfer value, because that is the amount of cash that is going to the service provider? This was a very heated debate for us that cropped up actually a number of times even before the working group met in person. But we found when we sat down and actually looked at the issues that reasonably quickly a solution fell out. So let's start with a simple valuation example. And for this program, we're going to take a simple food basket. It's going to be predictable. There is not an expected increase or fluctuation in the number of beneficiaries. We're going to use a mobile money transfer mechanism with 850 beneficiaries over a year, once a month, $50, service fees of 44%, and payment is expected monthly. The result is, my window's in the way. If you calculate it out, it's $1,700 for the service fees per month. The transfer value, the amount that eventually goes to beneficiaries, is $42,500 for a total transfer on a monthly basis of $44,000. If you look at the total service fees, oh, there's a typo there. It's actually $20,400. And the total value being transferred through the service provider over the course of this year is over $500,000. Now, let's compare that against a very basic, hiccup, matrix. Head of unit can approve 2,000, country director goes all the way up. What happens with the valuation discussion, if you're valuing it only on the fees paid during a single transfer, that money can often effectively be approved almost as petty cash. If you're looking at the fees for the entire contract, it's significantly up, but it's still within the country director and it's not under the awareness of larger or higher procurement authorities. As soon as you start adding the value, the transfer value, the contract skyrockets. So the scope of the argument goes, you could look at this contract anywhere from petty cash to being approved by the executive director at over $500,000. Depends on how you look at the problem. So what are really the constraints and concerns about this? If you are transferring that entire cash value, when you're transferring the cash value to the beneficiary, it has to actually go through the service provider before it can be transferred to the beneficiary. Now, with any sort of goods, for the most part, payment is issued after you receive the goods. But the problem with cash transfers is you can't have proof of performance because the actual proof of performance is the transfer. And in some cases, even beneficiaries have to cash in their vouchers or actually process the receipt of the funds in order for there to be proof of receipt and therefore proof of performance of the service being conducted, and which would be generally a prerequisite for making payment to the service provider. So that's a bit of a problem. Ways, speed, contract approval. If you are looking at the value as a single monthly service fee versus the entire contract value, you end up with the big procurement thresholds, and then you have a lot more requirements. And so there have been a lot of concerns about, well, if we limit it to just the fees, then we can get the contracts and the payments approved much more quickly. But is that approach therefore putting the organization or company or the humanitarian agency at risk? Flexibility. Procurement has historically required specific details about, okay, well, how much is going to be paid and when is it going to be paid? They want exact dollar amounts around when transfers are going to happen. In the humanitarian sector these days, you have varying caseloads that you may be scaling up. You have changes in program duration. You may not know exactly what's going to be required over the course of this program, and requiring that detail up front really limits your ability to effectively contract service providers. And finally, understanding. Staff, procurement, supply chain staff are all trying to really find a way to make cash transfer service providers fit into existing regulations and existing guidelines and the frameworks which they have established for their organizations. But the reality of the needs of the organization and the reality of the complexity of the services being provided doesn't actually fit. It's new, it's different, and really ought to be looked at in a slightly different way. And that gets at that, how do you test a different technology or do a pilot program? That would be an example of how do you run that hadn't really been approached before. So these issues, those constraints, were reviewed by this team of Red Cross, NGO, UN organizations to find a solution that might work, with the goal of managing the risk exposure without compromising the speed or flexibility of the procurement and the payment. The agreement that we came up with, or proposed best solution, or proposed best practice, excuse me, was to work with a framework agreement and have that framework agreement include sort of acceptable change parameters. So if the caseload goes up by 15% and the total value of the agreement is going to have to expand to cover that, put parameters in where you don't have to go back through the total procurement approval process until you hit those thresholds. Further, you can label the contract fees as the contract value, but you still have to cover that risk, the exposure. And there are multiple ways of doing that. One is using a proof of performance. And the proof of performance needs to be equal to the amount that is exposed at any particular time. So the proof of performance does not need to cover the entire contract. The proof of performance may only need to cover one distribution cycle. And if the service provider can't handle a proof of performance of a full distribution cycle, there is also the option of decreasing the distribution, the length of time between distributions. So if you increase the number of distributions, the frequencies, and you can make the value exposed at any one time a lot smaller. But the important point is to make sure that the exposure is understood by the organization, the exposure is covered, establish an agreement that is flexible, and then you can proceed by managing the payments on a single monthly basis, and that should help keep the speed factor moving. Finally, we spoke about raising awareness within operations staff who have not been as involved as program or management to date in cash programs, to make them understand the issues and constraints of managing these types of contracts and getting them approved and operating these types of programs, and how do you make sure that the staff continue to push through procurement actions quickly and efficiently to make sure programs can be executed without compromising audit or compliance issues. So that is my summary. Now I'm supposed to hand this over to Isabel, and she can, there we go.
Thank you. I'm not going to, yeah, no, yeah, this is perfect. I'll just, so thank you, Natalie, for explaining that background to the Fritz work, and also for laying out this proposed approach in terms of framework agreements that leave some flexibility for addressing the different risk parameters that we've been talking about. There are a number of questions coming through. So one of them, one of them is about risk, and I think this is building on Claire's intervention earlier. So the question is, I would like to hear more about the risks involved in this procurement process. I've only heard one risk, which was creditworthiness. That's what Claire raised earlier on, but please advise on more. So that's the first question. And then I think we will move on to questions on framework agreements, because I think there are strong opinions about that as well. So first question on risk for you, Natalie, please.
Creditworthiness is one way of phrasing it. Really, it is the risk exposure of putting the entire transfer value on the balance sheet of the organization. And it, for lack of a better way of putting this, taking off with your $50,000 or whatever the current distribution cycle amount is, or any problems that they might have. What happens if that particular company fails? Your funds are not secured the way banks are required to hold sort of insured deposits. Shipping companies are regulated by international maritime law. They have insurance requirements for the goods that they have on board. Banks have these required secure items to secure their deposits, but these fintech companies don't have anything. One analogy I heard was the equivalent of using Uber versus a formal taxi company. Uber isn't regulated. Insurance requirements, how do you know about? Anyway, that's the big risk.
Natalie, that's very clear, and I hope that answers the question. Silver had a question on framework agreements, saying framework agreements may not work in some places. Maybe if you've got a running program, yes, they can. I guess a question that I would also have is, are we talking about framework agreements at a national level or at a global level? Any reflections on the feasibility of using framework agreements, please, Natalie?
Thomas Edison said somebody had asked him if he had failed at making a light bulb, and he had said that, no, I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways it won't work. And he hadn't gotten to so he had eliminated a whole bunch of processes and hadn't gotten to finding the one that did work. It's going to be different for every single situation, and there is going to be problems and complexities that are different to every single program. There will be regulations in your country from your government that don't apply anywhere else, and you have to find the one that does work. And there are limitations to framework agreements and how you structure them and how you put terminology in place, and whether you require them at certain times and such. You have to work with your organization, your compliance department, your legal, to find the ways that will work for you. It's not a very concrete answer, unfortunately, but nothing about implementing cash is concrete. Almost everything is. Well, it depends. How's it going to work? You have to figure it out.
Okay, well, I think that might be something that Sarah Murray is going to tackle in her intervention a little bit later. I just want to also reflect on a couple of additional comments that we've received on risk. So one is from Krista Lancome from DCA, who's saying financial risks are very different using mobile money or e-vouchers. Another reflection from Norma Torres is, in reality, credit risk is the largest risk in these transactions. The issue is whether organizations are adequately assessing this risk. And interestingly, an interesting point saying logistics area, I guess logistics functions are not necessarily equipped to assess this risk. So any further reflections on those 2 points? So mobile money and e-vouchers, and then the issue of credit risk and who's best placed. Back to you.
In particular, whether or not logistics and procurement are in a position to evaluate that risk, I would agree, absolutely not. Finance is the expert on the financial markets, on banks, it is their job to advise on that. So the procurement officer or logistics team should be guiding effective procurement processes and making sure that competition occurs, and you don't compromise procurement rules, but they should look to the experts in the particular area, which would be finance or IT, for advice on the technology side. Actually, to go back to the question earlier on, before I spoke about the sole supplier position, this might become a big problem for logistics, because even if a company is a sole supplier of a specific technology, they are not, that doesn't necessarily make them the sole supplier of the service that you're looking for, which is the transfer to the beneficiaries. So you can run a procurement process where you're putting transfer mechanisms against each other to find, you may have different transfer mechanisms in there, and you're looking for the one that will be the best for your organization.
Thanks, Natalie. Claire has just been commenting to me that finance might be the expert on banks, but they are struggling with the new, more unregulated and non-traditional financial service providers, and that's something that she also raised in her presentation. So actually, I'd like to take this opportunity to move the discussion on to Sarah Murray from ELAN, who I know has been doing some reflection on this specific issue. So thank you very much, Natalie. And Sarah, over to you, please.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Sorry,
Great.
Lily. Not Sarah.
No, this is Sarah, actually.
Oh, it is Sarah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No worries. He's here on Skype with me, at least. So first of all, thanks for organizing this really timely, necessary discussion, Isabel and CaLP, and Claire for the very clear framing of the challenge. I think kind of dividing this into 2 categories of, can we work with suppliers, kind of what are our regulatory constraints, and then will they actually provide us with a solution that we want and need on the program side is really a nice way of framing this, and great to see institutes like Fritz taking this up. I think I'll start with some feedback on the framework agreement proposal, which I, initially responded very positively to, in terms of that being a solution that can help us get through some of the day-to-day struggles we see in the field with kind of cumbersome selection processes, where we're really struggling with these questions about how to select those financial service providers that will give us the best service, and then finding ourselves having found one that works and then having to retender all the same because we didn't allot for enough transfer value at the beginning of the contract. So I think that's a really viable solution on that front. Some questions that it raises for me include, I think the larger issue of us needing to dig a little deeper and improve our capacity to understand this larger category of fintech providers. Claire, I would echo your response that, while definitely our finance teams are the lead on understanding banks and how to work with them, in my experience, 9 times out of 10, it's the program people that are identifying, finding, ready to experiment with some of the newer fintech solutions. And so there is a bit of an opportunity for programs and a need for programs and procurement and finance folks to work together and better understand this landscape. I think, there's obviously a huge level of diversity in these suppliers and the fintech suppliers and how they are regulated, both kind of within countries and between countries. In general, I think there's just a lot of learning and a lot of capacity building on our part to understand the various classes of risks and what types of providers merit what types of risk management strategies. So excited to be working a bit on through the ELAN on some of those questions and developing some resources to dig into those technical bits, because I think as Natalie and Claire have raised, there's a lot of question marks and a lot of need to better understand what will actually provide us with a reliable solution at the end of the day. I think one other thing that has come up in a number of discussions is the fact that, not all solutions are created equal, both in their quality of services, but also in what they offer us. So a provider that can offer both money transfer services straight to beneficiaries and a really robust data management platform that cuts down on our direct costs for monitoring and evaluation is going to require a different fee structure probably than something that's just a basic transfer service. And I think we're struggling with and needing to get better at defining what the value is of the services that are provided. I'll just close by saying that one thing we're working on through the ELAN is trying to understand the private sector perspective and engaging with us on some procurement processes. We've heard informally in feedback that the private sector finds our way of purchasing services from them to be cumbersome and time-consuming and sometimes unclear in what it is that we're actually asking for. So we're interested to host a conversation that will start in September in London, try to get some information from their end on how might we be treating these processes differently than other industries that they normally engage in. So I'm going to paste a link to a survey in the chat box in a few seconds here. If you guys have suppliers you've been working with or on RFPs, we'd be eager for you to share this and as an opportunity for us to collect some feedback and hopefully feed into some useful tools. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Sarah. And great that ELAN is taking this discussion forward. I think this is a perfect example of how CaLP can, through its information platforms, can highlight discussions, and then organizations with a more specialized mandate, such as ELAN, can take them forwards in a collaborative way. So we have a final formal speaker, who is Richard Atkinson from Oxfam. So be interesting to hear from you, Richard, some operational perspectives and some of the challenges that you might have faced around this issue. And then I see lots more questions coming through, which I hope will help us shape the last part of the discussion, and that I might point towards particular members of the group, so or particular panelists. So over to you, Richard.
Hi. Yeah, I was just hoping to advocate on behalf of using framework agreements. I was part of the debate that Natalie talked about earlier, and I can talk about a particular example in one of our responses last year, where this was a big response, and we were struggling to get an agreement in place because we were struggling to get all the information in terms of assessment of the FSP, but also in terms of what we wanted to put through the agreement, so the size of the contract and the volume of payments we wanted to make. And without the two together, it was very hard to get the thing agreed. Whereas if you have a framework agreement which can be set up just as rigorously as any contract, but taking into account, you know, a projected volume and then these kind of things, you can have that in place so that it's ready when the program teams are ready to put their cash through it. And you have two teams running in parallel, one looking at the programmatic issues for the value of work going through, and the other one looking at the technical issues and the assessments and the risk of using the certain providers. And I think if we had been able to do that, we would have got our cash program running much faster. It's not. We have also been having the debates about the value of the contract, and to a degree that becomes less important with this, because you can have this framework agreement signed off at whatever level you need. It's then in place regardless of how much money you actually put through it, and you also have the choice of whether you use the framework agreement or not, because you may find in certain circumstances the agreement isn't actually going to meet your requirements, and then you can go through an alternative method as long as you haven't committed to putting everything through in the first place. That was pretty much what I wanted to contribute.
Richard, perhaps could I ask you a question which is sort of linking your intervention back to Claire's at the beginning in terms of common delivery platforms and so I guess agency harmonization on agreements. So do you envisage that an optimal solution would be one where we work towards framework agreements, but that there's also consensus across agencies in terms of what these would include?
I would, yes. I mean, I can see how that would be the way forward, but I think it would be something you'd want to work on. You wouldn't want to work on that as a response started. Collaboration which just starts with a response is going to be tricky, because you're going to be starting from sort of square one. These are the kind of agreements I would want to see us working on now in advance of responses. It also comes back to this question about whether you're doing framework agreements internationally or whether you're doing just for a particular response. I think at the moment we would just be at the stage where we would want to do this response by response, but nevertheless I know we are engaged with projects with larger international organisations which might be applicable here, but I'm not quite sure where we are in terms of whether we could actually go live with one of those at the moment. But yeah, it's something to be working towards, but not something we just drop into straight away, I think.
Thanks, Richard. Are there any reflections from Claire or Natalie on this on the subject of framework agreements? Say, Claire, given perhaps it would be interesting to get your perspective, given it seems like from your intervention, like IFRC are quite far along with these reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that framework agreements are definitely one solution, and agree with Richard. I mean, we were going to go to tender this year on frameworks, but realised that actually we need to refine our requirements a bit more to make sure what we put in place is robust. So this year we're working operation to operation. And whilst it's a good solution, it's not the panacea, of course. We will still have to, when we do the cash feasibility in country, it might not be suitable to use that framework. But for me, it still doesn't get us around that problem of how do we evaluate. Even if we go out to a framework, it gets us over the challenge of having met the procurement processes and not being limited. But what information are we going to use to evaluate suppliers? What is best practice to ask them for? And how are we confident then we can work with them? So that still doesn't solve the problem for me of the evaluation and selection of supplier.
So, okay, building on that then, Claire, one of the questions that I've seen come through now in the chat from Silvere is, would you recommend key criteria on selecting suppliers? Now, you mentioned earlier on in your intervention that you had been starting to look at a matrix that's looking at these key criteria and potentially like what's mandatory, what's good enough. Are you able to elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I feel like that's a theme that the audience might want to know more about.
Yeah, sure. The matrix was actually on what information we want to gather, but yeah, I definitely think there's a link then, and I wrote down what Sarah talked about, which was what type of risks are we trying to mitigate against. So actually, I think I'm going to go back to that as the starting point. What are we trying to mitigate, and therefore, then what information do we need? And so that will then link with this documents or information matrix of what information do we need to make the decision. And I'll be able to share that later. I need to go through that internally first, but I'd be happy to share that. But I think in terms of the key criteria, we have just updated our supplier evaluation sheet for cash. Because it was very good base to start with, and this is where we're coming unstuck. So, for example, one of the criteria was to have a credit rating, and the most typical one is Dun & Bradstreet, but those are not necessarily applicable to all suppliers, and so several of the suppliers that we looked at don't have those ratings. So therefore, that key criteria that we've got on our valuation sheet is a bit of a challenge. So we are going to have to go a little bit back onto the drawing board on that, I think, and then say what is a realistic criteria. So I don't have them yet, and that's something that I would like to work towards, and so I'm also interested to see, do other agencies already have those, or are we all still in the same boat of trying to figure out what is the best criteria? But I'd like us to get to that point of agreeing ultimately what we think is the best practice and best criteria.
Thanks, Claire. So Krista has highlighted that NetHope has a tool called the Service Provider Capacity Assessment. Krista, if I unmute you, would you be able to tell us a little bit more about that and whether you've used it yourself, please? You should be unmuted now, Krista. Okay, maybe that's not working. Okay, yeah. Do others have examples of capacity assessment surveys that they've used, or of how to navigate some of these criteria which may seem very rigid and not necessarily applicable to certain contexts? If you do, please ask in the chat box or by raising your hands. Okay, I can see that STEEP and IRC are working on a tool. That's that's an intervention by Laura Meissner at OFDA. And then Krista is saying that they have used it. Okay, that's positive. So I hope that as the Fritz discussions progress, that this is something that that can be considered in terms of the capacity building materials on CTP operations that are being developed. I'm just looking through the questions now to see if there are things that we've missed which we can try and tackle in this discussion. So there's some consensus on the fact that service agreements will certainly help, and Arnel telling us that they have different service agreements with several FSPs and do amendments along the way. So that point that Natalie raised in terms of flexibility. Yeah. Okay. I think those are the key points being raised at so far, and Natalie has also she's suggested running a kind of topical working group discussion like this one on valuation, but specifically on the criteria. Perhaps, Sarah, could I ask you to say a little bit more about what you envisage the content of the ELAN workshop will be in September, so that we can, evaluate whether it would address this issue of criteria, please?
Sure. So the workshop that we're envisioning in September is going a little bit more broadly than just this valuation question. The objectives of the workshop are to provide an opportunity for the private sector to and humanitarians to understand common pain points of procurement processes in general, recognizing the limitations that our particular operational models and funding models may present that are different to other types of industries. Some of the things that we want to touch on in the event include, how do we ensure that there's some space and room for dialogue between us who are asking for services and those who could provide them, to make sure that we're clear and that they understand what it is that we need without violating any sorts of clear and transparent processes. And kind of digging into issues about what needs to happen at a global level, or to what extent can we articulate and pre-position agreements globally versus what needs to be done really at a local level, where the limitations and opportunities there. So it's very much focused on kind of bringing further understanding to that quote-unquote fintech world, and making sure that our processes kind of take into account the realities of what's available in those providers.
Thanks. So it sounds like it might touch upon the issue of selection criteria, but not necessarily cover it in depth, if that's right. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Yes, though I think there's still some flexibility to shape the agenda, so that's something we could make sure gets touched on if there's demand for it.
Okay, great. Good to hear. So I'm going to aim towards wrapping up, because I can see that there aren't too many questions in the chat box right now. But I think actually I just see a question from Christopher Pritchard right now, which is, maybe I missed this, but did we get a response or agreement on the fees versus total amount question? Now, to me, what I'm sensing from this discussion is that some organizations have clearly made a decision on that, whilst others have not. And this is also what was coming out through the D groups. So just going back to Claire's presentation at the outset, she was saying that from IFRC's perspective, that they have come up with consensus in terms of the contract valuation, and my understanding was that that was based on the fees and not the total amount, and that therefore the procurement thresholds would be based on those as well. Now, what Natalie's presentation showed is that is all the different models for valuing the contract, and looking at issues of time and duration and frequency of payments and so on as well. So whilst it seems like IFRC are quite far ahead, I would say that that consensus is not necessarily there, and that's why the paper which the Fritz task team have been working on will be live as a Google Doc on CaLP's website going forward after this event, so that you can all contribute to this discussion, comment on your own challenges and experiences of contract valuation, and we're hoping that that can somehow help us move towards a consensus, bearing in mind, from what I hear, even for the bigger organizations, knowing that they have, that they have alignment with other peer organizations can be very valuable. Thanks for raising that again, Christopher. So just to try and wrap up a bit on this discussion, my sense is that we potentially could be going towards some consensus on the issue of contract valuation and procurement thresholds. But where the biggest discussions still lie is in terms of the procurement process and what information is really required to get that authorized. And Whether framework agreements are the solution to that, I mean, they seem like a viable solution in certain contexts, but nonetheless, the issue of what is it that we're actually measuring these suppliers against, so the criteria and how you verify it is the key sticking point, particularly as we look at a diversification of the types of financial service providers that we're considering working with. And also what I understand from the discussion is that whilst that's a challenge that every organisation is facing individually, this poses even more of a challenge when we're thinking about potentially working at an interagency level and a move towards common delivery platforms. So it's very important that we find the space to be able to harmonise on these issues, reduce risk, whilst also making sure that we're not being more risk averse because we're talking about cash transfers than if it were another type of assistance. So in terms of next steps and taking this discussion forwards then, we've heard from Sarah about the ELAN workshop, and I hope that even if it is limited to a smaller group, that through this survey that ELAN have shared and through other opportunities through CaLP's dgroup and so on, there will be opportunities for you all to input into that workshop. Then, as I mentioned, we have the Google Doc, which is going to be on our website, which we really strongly encourage you to input into. This is, you know, an exciting opportunity for co-creation of a product, and we're keen to see how it can work. And that in turn will feed back into the Fritz work and to the standard CTP operations materials, which will be rolling out towards the end of the year. Alongside other revised capacity building materials from CaLP. So thank you very much, all of you, to the panelists and to the participants with all your questions for raising some of these issues and putting them out on the table, and we've certainly got many opportunities to follow up with them. So thanks all and have a good rest of the day.